I'd like to begin just by thanking Professor Cassidy for the invitation to present our work here. It's a great honour to be here, so thank you very much for inviting me. So the microphone up again, yeah. Okay, is that any better? Okay, so all you missed was me thanking Professor Cassidy for the invitation to present my work here, the work that me and Harry are doing here. It's a great honour to be here. Okay, so the paper itself puts forward ideas that to some extent are still under development, but hopefully they will speak to the broader conference theme of history and philosophy of science in a time of change. It certainly feels like a time of change in the UK, and to some extent that's what we're trying to pick up on in this paper. Okay. In preparation for coming here, we were asked to provide a copy of the paper. I'm not sure who has had access to that paper and who's seen it and who hasn't. So just by way of warning, the presentation that I'm about to give differs slightly from that paper. The main way in which it differs is there's much more preamble and background and introduction to this presentation than there is to the actual paper version itself. And that's mainly because when I practiced giving this paper before I came, the question that everybody said was, you need more introduction. It doesn't make sense if you just launch straight into it. So before we get to the bit that was in the paper that I submitted back in July, there's some more background and context about where, in terms of thinking in science and technology studies, the arguments that I'm going to put forward come from. So there's a little bit about, in order to motivate what is there, about what we mean when we say democracy and what we mean when we say populism. And the way in which we get there is by thinking through sociologically the nature of a social group and allowing us to identify some sort of common or core characteristics. And to sort of anticipate where we're going with this, one of the things that we say defines the difference between democracy and populism, because we'll see they can sort of shape each other, is the attitude they take to pluralism, with democracy being rather more relaxed about pluralism and populism being much keener on eliminating it. Then we get to the sort of the core STS stuff, which is really how do we, as analysts of science, understand what makes science distinctive from other ways of producing knowledge. In particular, we focus on the values of science rather than the epistemology of science, and use that as the basis of an argument for why we should value science, and in particular argue that it functions as one of the system of checks and balances within a democratic society, and that's really its most important role, and that's the way in which we would like to defend its contribution to democracy, and also to see it as a bulwark against the rise of populism. And then to finish off then, we think briefly about the sort of the practical implications of this. And again, fairly sociologically, the argument is that if we see democracy like science as a kind of practice and as a kind of culture, then in order to defend science and defend democracy, this is not merely a matter of top-down disseminating ideas, it's a matter of bottom-up actually living the practices, walking the walk, rather than just talking the talk. So that's roughly where we're going to try and go over the next 30 or 40 minutes. I will leave time at the end for questions. Okay, so just in terms of the background and context, so you're one slide ahead of me, aren't you? Okay, now we're back in sync. To start with the wider and political context, this is the sense in which it seems to me and Harry that there is something changing, certainly in American and European democracies. I mean, at one level, it's clear there's always been populist elements in these. Oops, sorry, gone too far now. Don't follow me. I've pressed the wrong button. I've lost the screen notes. There's always been populist elements in our society. What we're saying has changed, I suppose, is the prominence and the kind of mainstreaming of those arguments and those positions within these societies. And the slide just illustrates a number of these events that have happened in the UK, other European democracies, and America. So in UK, The Brexit referendum is a big thing for us, but you've also got the rise of the Freedom Party in Austria, similar parties in Holland and Germany. You've got the Five Star Movement in Italy. You've got increasingly authoritarian presidents in place in Hungary and Turkey, and the most sort of egregious example, if you like, of the way in which this rise to populism leads to challenges to not just the status quo in terms of elite institutions, but to expertise and scientific expertise in particular, is obviously the election of Donald Trump as President of the United States. So I think what we're saying is that there is a sense in which things are changing, but what I want to try and focus on in this talk is the extent to which any of this is a concern for or relevant to us in our kind of professional role. I mean, clearly, as citizens in these countries or in these neighboring countries, we might have a view about whether or not this is a good or bad thing. But I want to focus specifically on our professional role as analysts in some sense of the scientific endeavor or scientific institutions. Does the rise of these populist, more authoritarian sentiments in the wider society have any role for us professionally? I want to argue that it does. And the purpose of this presentation, I guess, is then to show how this might be the case, how we might cash this out and argue that as scholars of science, people who understand what science is, how science works, we have a particular contribution to make to this debate that goes beyond our role merely as citizens in that society. Okay. At one level, I suppose this is not a new argument. The position that we're setting out now was first published best part of 15 years ago, or just over 15 years ago, in the paper that's highlighted on the slide there, the Third Wave of Science Studies paper that Harry and me co-authored. And that paper makes a number of points, really. The first thing, I guess, that's important to state in a philosophy context is that it accepts the social constructionist description of science associated with science and technology studies. So in that sense, it's not in any way at all defending a realist depiction of science. It's not defending a realist epistemology. It's not defending a realist philosophy of science. In fact, it's taking a position that's quite contrary to those. So it might be controversial in that sense. Within STS, I guess its more controversial status comes from the fact that despite explicitly starting from this social constructivist position and accepting that this is how science actually works, it then goes on to argue that expertise is real and not just a status, not just a matter of attribution. And it also goes on to make a distinction between technical and political phases in technological decision-making, which is also something that sits uncomfortably with some elements of the social constructivist position, where obviously the tendency is to blur the distinction between facts and values, and this appears to separate them out. I mean, just to say a little bit more about how those arguments are made. The argument that expertise is real essentially depends on recognizing the importance of tacit knowledge, and the idea that tacit knowledge is acquired through socialization, and that tacit knowledge is an important constituent part of expertise. And the argument is simply that if becoming an expert means acquiring tacit knowledge, then becoming an expert means being socialized into that community, and socialization either happens or it doesn't. You're either a member of that community, you've either interacted with those people, or you haven't. And if you haven't had the social interaction, then you can't gain the tacit knowledge, then you can't be an expert. And so in that sense, expertise is real, regardless of whether or not anybody else in the society grants the status of expertise to the people that possess that knowledge. So that's how we want to argue that expertise is, as real, can be distinguished from the social status of the label expert. In terms of distinguishing between the technical and political, then it kind of follows on from that argument, really. To the extent that you see expertise as being linked to the experiences that people have, the experiences that people have will differ. There will therefore be a distribution of expertise, with some people having more of one kind of expertise and less of another. And what we're saying is that when it comes to technological decision-making, you can distinguish between those aspects of the decision-making where you want people with specialist expertise to take part, and therefore only those with the relevant experience should be included, and those more broadly based political, democratic aspects of it, in which case having specialist expertise is not required and may even be a hindrance. And so by thinking about the distribution of expertise, you can also think about the distribution of, or the availability of, different kinds of participants for taking part in technological decision making. Okay, so just to sort of summarize that in the diagram that we put in the paper, the three waves refer to three different ways of thinking about the relationship between experts who might be scientists but who might not be, and lay people or citizens in technological decision making in the public domain, by which we're really talking about policy decisions that have some element of scientific or technical knowledge as a constituent part of what needs to be considered when making the decision. So, as you're looking at it, wave one on the left is something of a straw man, admittedly, but it's the characterization of and its role in policy making if you see science as being true, objective. It's kind of a post-World War II version of science policy making, where science provides authoritative knowledge which is pretty much non-negotiable, and in which the role of lay people, the wider citizenry, is kind of to accept this truth and deal with it, essentially. So in its more extreme forms, it would look like technocracy. In its milder forms, it looks a bit like technological determinism. But it's very much a case, it's a sort of social system in which scientists are the authoritative. They give knowledge, citizens receive knowledge. Okay. In a sense, it's that sort of the relationship between society that we see wave two, mainstream STS, as kind of reacting against and pushing back against when it's making its critique of science and arguing for the contingent cultural nature of scientific practice. In essence, by showing that there is no special epistemology going on when scientists are doing science, by showing that scientific knowledge is in some sense mundane and ordinary, even if a bit esoteric, it's eliminating that boundary between science and society, and in so doing, it's making it porous, it's making it possible for people who are not scientists to contribute their expertise. And there are all manner of case studies in this sort of tradition that show how people from outside the narrowly defined scientific community have relevant expertise and experience that could and should be brought to bear on these kinds of decision makings, because they are able to challenge and contextualize the knowledge claims that scientists are making. Brian Wynn's work, for one, is a classic example of this sort of work, but there's lots of it in science and technology studies. And when I said on the previous slide that we're starting from that position, I mean it. We are starting from that position. Where we differ, I guess, is that and this is what makes wave 3 different from wave 2, I suppose, is that we're arguing that there's a kind of, because there's a distribution of experiences and a distribution of expertises, you've got to be more careful than I think we have been in the past in attributing expertise to lay people. And so there's a sense in the middle diagram where the boundary is eliminated completely. We talk about democratizing science, and as it were, the qualities that made these original people, the sheep farmers of Brian Wynn or the treatment advocates of Steve Epstein studies, things that made them special and different and able to contribute, kind of get lost in their mischaracterization as ordinary folk. They're not ordinary folk. They are people with particular experiences and specialist knowledge. So what we want to argue for, and this is where the technical and the political phase comes in, is the sort of the top left-hand quadrant there where we've got certified specialists and uncertified specialists. That's the bit where you can combine the specialist expertise of science with the experience-based expertise of patient groups or local residents or other kinds of citizen groups that have relevant complementary experiences, and they all belong to the realm of specialist expertises. And the the bit to the right includes both scientists from other disciplines and all the other ordinary citizens who have no particular specialist expertise. They can't contribute as experts, but nevertheless they can contribute as citizens. And that's really the distinction that we're making. And in order to characterize the distinction between those two ways of going on, we're arguing that it's the norms and values of those two different processes that matter. So the technical phase is characterized by scientific norms, of which I'll say more later. The political phase is characterized by democratic norms. And again, we'll say a little bit more about those later. But the point is that they're different. And it's the difference of values that differentiates them. So rather than there being a fact-value distinction going on here, it's really a kind of value-value distinction. There's scientific values on the one hand, contrasted with democratic values on the other. Okay, so now we can get on to the science, onto the democracy and populism bit. And as I say, this is now where I'm going to draw on some basic sociological ideas. So they have philosophical roots as well, to kind of characterize what we mean by democracy and populism in order to give some working definitions that we can then build on for the rest of the presentation. As you're mostly philosophers, I'm hoping you'll be relaxed with the idea that the argument is going to be theoretical rather than empirical. We're going to talk about these concepts primarily as ideal types. We'll illustrate them with examples, but it's really trying to abstract some general features that will apply across a whole variety of different cases, is the aim of what's going on. And for those of you that know Harry's work, it will come as no surprise that the kind of key concept, the philosophical foundation of it, is going to be Wittgenstein's idea of form of life, and the idea of meaningful action being the way in which meaning is use. Ideas and actions being two sides of the same coin. That's the kind of principle that we're working with here. And in what follows, we're going to try and apply this sociologically to understand the role of knowledge and practice in social groups. So, in terms of what is a social group, I mean, this is a photo from the World Cup that was here not so long ago. These are football fans. Football fans are a kind of social group, I'm going to argue. And what we're interested in is trying to understand what makes a social group a social group. And the idea is that the arguments and the principles that we're going to set forward should apply whether or not the social group is a social group of football fans, as in this case, a professional group like sociologists, a more diffuse group like English people, British people, Russian people. The idea is that what we're trying to do is identify some general features that apply regardless of which sort of group you're talking about. Two things, I suppose, that are worth mentioning before we get going in terms of how we think about a social group. One is that, for us, it's not necessarily the case that the members of a social group have to be self-consciously aware of being members of a social group. I know there are some social scientists in our department who say that it's not a social group if people don't know that they're a member of it. We want to say that it is possible to be a member of a social group without knowing it. And so, for example, the community of English language speakers is our example of this. If you speak the English language, then you are a member of that social group, even if you don't necessarily recognize it as being such, because the capacity to speak the English language depends on being socialized into that group, whether you're aware of it or not. And to be fair, most children are not aware of it, but nevertheless they speak the language. So that's one important distinction. And The other important distinction, I suppose, is that not everything can be a social group. There are some similarities between people that don't count as social groups. So people that wear brown shoes, for example, wouldn't be, I don't think, a social group, even if it's possible for dress codes to be part of the ways in which people signify their membership of other social groups. Simply being a person who wears brown shoes does not, as far as I know, make you a member of the social group brown shoe wearers. Okay. So, to put that more formally, what we're arguing really is that you can think of any social collectivity as having two distinct elements or faces, two ways in which you can think about what's going on. On the one hand, you've got what we've called here the organic face, and these are the things that are uniform across the social group, more or less. The practices, the conventions, the beliefs that bind the group together and make it a group. So there's a sense in which as you're socialized into a social group, you can't choose these things. These are the things that are given to you through being a member of that social group. So, for example, if you're a member of the social group football fans, it's kind of constitutive of that you like football and enjoy watching it and you think it's important and exciting and interesting and all those things. The enumerative face of the social group is, if you like, the variation around that core uniformity. So it's the kind of possibilities, choices, the differences that don't make a difference in order to be a member of the group. So these are the things that you can choose. Obviously, the nature and range of what may be chosen varies over time, but the point is that you can be a member of the social group and do these different things and still be a member. They don't put you beyond the pale. So if we think about how that then applies to social groups and democracy or democratic societies, the way in which we would characterize a democratic society, and this is where we're offering our definition now that perhaps differs in some ways from the more elaborate typologies you get in political science books. Our definition or of a democratic society, the ideas and practices that we draw out as being important and common to all of them are these ideas of citizens as free and equal before the law, the importance of checks and balances, role of free elections, and so on. So there are some kinds of things that even if they're operationalized differently within different forms of democracy, if they're not there, it's kind of hard to see how democracy is going on at all. So these are the kind of uniform, organic, constitutive parts of a democratic society. And then the enumerative elements of a democratic society, they are the range of views and preferences within that society that are recognized as being legitimate, appropriate, are encouraged, celebrated, tolerated, whatever. So, there's I suppose, in Rawlsian terms, the organic face is pretty clearly aligned with his principles of liberal democracy, citizens as free and equal before the law, and so on. The enumerative face more or less corresponds, I guess, to what Rawls would call the comprehensive doctrines or that kind of stuff. So what we're arguing is that we can see democratic societies as a kind of balancing act between these organic features which have to be there and which, if they change very slowly, and these more variable enumerative features which may change more quickly and which at any one point in time will be different across a range of different democratic societies. Okay. So just to spell that out in just a little bit more detail. So what we're saying in, to make it clear, is a democratic society, or a well-functioning democracy at least, has regular elections that are seen to be free and fair. Again, I mean, these are, in some sense, I recognize these are aspirational statements. With any well-functioning democracy, there will be questions about the extent to which any particular election has been as free and fair as it might possibly be, but nevertheless, the unquestioned aspiration is that the election should be as free and fair as possible, and any deviation from that is seen as a problem that needs to be fixed. Likewise, you'd have a government led by the parties who gain the largest number of elected representatives. Again, within different forms of democracy, there will be different routes to determining who that might be, and it may or may not be that the largest number of elected representatives corresponds to the largest number of votes. Not everything is a perfect PR system. But nevertheless, there will be a mechanism in place through which votes in the election are translated into some form of government. And the mechanism for doing that will be clear. So that's the kind of front stage element of democracy that people focus on a lot. But what we've also added to that is the idea that, again, a well-functioning democracy also has these other kinds of features. It has a legitimate role for opposition parties, the people that didn't gain just number of elected representatives. And they're an important part of a well-functioning democracy as well. They have important work to do in holding the government to account. Likewise, there may be different levels of government. It might be a federal system, you might have a multi-cameral system. Again, these are the things that vary across different democratic states, but within any democratic state you'll have some version of this form of check and balance. Likewise, independent judiciary, again, arguments about how independent it is, but nevertheless, the principle that it should be independent is not for discussion. And likewise, a free press, again, you might argue, how free is it really? But nevertheless, the idea would be that it ought to be free, and the criticism would be that it's not free enough, not that it's too free. So with those sort of ideas in mind, we can start to think about then why and how we might differentiate democracy from populism. And I think it's important to do this because certainly in reading the political science literature around democracy and populism, and particularly reading book reviews about the slew of books that come out recently about populism and democracy, one of the standard tropes in these book reviews is, I don't agree with this author because I don't like their definition of populism. I think populism is this, they define populism as that, and therefore, because we disagree at the start, I reject everything that they say thereafter. So, accepting that as a risk and knowing there's nothing I can do about it, what I'm going to say now is, this is our definition of what populism is. It's not the only one out there, but it's the one that we're working with. So, one of the ways in which people represent populism, and this is one of the ways I think we want to reject, is that populism is somehow different from democracy because it claims to represent the will of the people. And clearly, democracy does that as well. So that doesn't really do much work if you say that populism is populism because it's popular and represents what people want. Democratic society is supposed to make sense. So I don't think that works. Likewise, there's a sense in which some people would define populism purely in terms of its anti-establishment rhetoric. So it's critical of elites and vested interests. And I'm not sure that works either, because I think within democratic societies, you would expect there to be a legitimate role for people and parties that do just that. So simply being opposed to the status quo or to whoever happens to be the current elite is not necessarily populist, if in that sense it means you're not being democratic. I think both of those things are perfectly compatible with a well-functioning democracy. Where the two start to diverge, I think, are in the attitudes that they take to pluralism and the roles of checks and balances. So, as part of the norms of democracy, we're arguing, there must be some kind of commitment to pluralism. And so to go back to our earlier definitions, that's a commitment to recognizing the value of those various enumerative elements. The background culture, the comprehensive doctrines. There are lots of different ways of going on in a democratic society, and this is okay. This is a good thing. In contrast, populism tends to be much less tolerant of the variety displayed in these enumerative elements, and this comes through the idea then of seeing of populist leaders, in particular, tending to reduce the complexity of their nation state or of their electorate to the views of that group that happened to vote for them, and then twisting that, if you like, so that then comes to stand for everybody. And so then you're either with them or you're against them, and then the difference of views becomes a deviant position rather than a legitimate position, because you're no longer one of the people anymore. You are an enemy of the people. So this rhetoric of the will of the people, with the people seen as a kind of unified, homogeneous group whose views and desires are articulated by the elected leader, is a core part of populism that doesn't really cash out in democracy because you have to represent and recognize the legitimacy of diversity in democracy. Likewise then, within democracy, although it's not necessarily beneficial for you as an individual, if you're understanding the importance of these institutions, you have to recognize the importance and the value of the systems of checks and balances, even when they kind of hinder you. In contrast, populism seems much less tolerant because these are invariably then implementation of the will of the people. And so the populist response to checks and balances is to kind of subvert or remove them in order that you can enact the will of the people more efficiently and more authentically. And so it's at that point, really, the different understanding of pluralism and checks and balances, I think, where you can really start to see a difference between democracy and populism. And in terms of those organic and enumerative elements, it's to do with the extent to which the organic face of democracy, the commitment to pluralism, is actually enacted. And in terms of the enumerative elements, it's the way in which variety is kind of, seen as a problem rather than strength. Seen this way, I think you can also then see why democracy was unstable. There's always the potential for it, I think, in any democratic society, for it to turn into something more populist. Part of the function of the way democracy works is it gives great power to the majority. The idea is that the checks and balances stop them abusing it, but nevertheless they do have great power. And this is the risk, and arguably this is what is happening in some of the examples we looked at earlier, is that it's slipping towards populism because the majority is no longer respecting the minority. So in practice, choices that belong to the enumerative, things that people should be allowed to do legitimately, are treated as if they belong to the organic, so they become natural rather than simply a choice. And things that were previously legitimate become reclassified as deviant or treacherous because they thwart the now clearly articulated will of the people. And that's how democracy slips into populism and into more authoritarian kinds of regimes. I mean, just to give a quick example, this is how it cashed out in Britain. So Daily Mail is a tabloid newspaper on the right-wing end of the political spectrum. In terms of the vote to leave the European Union, Daily Mail was very keen that the referendum result should go of leaving the European Union, which it did. Not by much, 52% to 48%, but nevertheless, the Leave campaign did win. And this is a headline that refers to a decision that was referred to the High Court, and the decision was whether or not the UK government needed to have a vote in order to begin the process of leaving the European Union. It wasn't whether or not the referendum result should stand or fall. It was a kind of procedural question as to what was the appropriate legal way of doing that. And the judges decided that the government couldn't do it by executive action, it needed to have a vote in the House of Commons. And the Daily Mail, amongst many other people on the Leave side of the argument, represented that decision that a vote in the House of Commons was necessary as an attempt to thwart the will of the people by delaying Brexit and preventing the referendum from being enacted. So you have this is just an example of the kind of ways in which relatively ordinary decisions become recategorized as acts of treachery or deviance. Okay, so moving on to science. I want to take a similar kind of approach to try and distinguish some features of science that we can then use to articulate its role in society and see how and why we might want to defend science as an important institution, regardless of where we stand on the realist constructivist debate about its epistemology. And the way in which we make the argument is similar. It's based on distinction between the organic and the enumerative, and in particular it's focusing on those kinds of organic values that characterize, if you like, the ideology of science, what it is that scientists need to think they're doing in order to be doing science scientifically. Again, it's a bit like democracy in the sense that it doesn't really matter so much if they deviate from that, as long as the deviations from it are seen as aberrations and not something that can be openly celebrated and maximized. So one of the ways in which we do this is and this is the argument of the Why Democracies Need Science book that was at the bottom of the slide that was shown earlier on, is to identify some of the norms of science. And so Miltonian norms are a core part of this. I think where we differ, I suppose, from the way in which they've been described in the past is that we would see them as a set of aspirations to which scientists ought to aspire rather than a description of what it is that they actually do. And to some extent, we argue, or at least should be shared with, the organic aspect of well-functioning democracy. So commitments to universalism and disinterestedness and honesty and so on seem to be a part of democracy as much as they're a part of science. Likewise, the essential tension in science manifests itself as how do you strike that balance between individual claims and the collective understanding. Likewise, in democracy, there's a tension between what rights you allow the individual and at what point you can curtail those rights for the benefit of the society overall. So there are some overlaps between the two. They're not completely isomorphic. There are some things in democracy that have no place in science, and vice versa. There are some things in science that aren't really relevant for democracy. So it's not that the two things are the same, but there is some common ground between the two of them. And what we're saying is that if we think about science in those terms, in terms of the values that it embodies, rather than the methods that it uses or the content of its knowledge, that gives us ways to think about why scientific knowledge might be preferable. So in the Why Democracies Need Science book, we simply make the argument that knowledge that is produced according to these norms is preferable in a moral sense to knowledge that's produced in other ways, and we kind of go through it in a sort of counterfactual way in terms of thinking about, well, would you prefer knowledge that was never tested? Is that preferable to knowledge that has been tested or not? Would you prefer knowledge that's promoted by people who have a clear interest in its outcome to knowledge that's developed by people who at least try to minimize the conflict of interest? Would you prefer knowledge that's produced by people who are open to criticism to knowledge that's preferred by people who refuse to engage with any form of criticism at all? And so this isn't really an epistemic argument as such. It's a kind of moral argument that it's just better to do things this way. So that's the argument of why democracies need science. In terms of how this relates to the populism and democracy and science thing, there are kind of two things that we're working on developing from that basic argument. One is that to the extent that we see that science and democracy have some shared values, to the extent that science then continues to uphold and embody these values, it has the potential to provide some kind of moral leadership in this domain. And if we think about the ways in which some of our elected leaders are behaving at the moment, this might become an increasingly important role for science, because it's not clear that the democratic institutions are upholding the values with quite the clarity that they're used to. So science potentially functions as a bulwark or a reservoir of these kinds of important values that matter for democratic society as much as they matter for science. And then the second bit we want to argue is that, and this is more the new bit, I suppose, is that we can also see science for this reason as part of the system of checks and balances. So we want to say that science fits into a democratic society in much the same way that a free press or an independent judiciary fits into democratic society. It's not there to rule, it's not there to take decisions, but it is there to make life a little bit difficult for the people that are elected. It's something that constrains maybe, or constrains, if not constrains their choices, but at least constrains the justifications that they're able to give for those choices. And in that sense, we shouldn't be any more worried about the fact that scientists are experts on science than we are worried about the fact that judges are experts on the law. It's kind of part and parcel of doing the role of being part of the ecosystem of checks and balances that scientists have this kind of expertise. Clearly, if you give too much weight to it, it becomes technocracy, and that's a bad thing. But also, if you don't give enough weight to it, it becomes populism, and that's a bad thing. So it's all about trying to find this sort of balance in the middle where science is recognized as being a preferable form of knowledge and seen as fitting into this system of checks and balances. And again, if you think about how populist leaders think about science, arguably they undermine science for exactly the same reason they undermine the judiciary and the media. The kinds of arguments that they make are very similar. Ironically, they're very similar to the kinds of arguments we often make in science and technology studies. They position science and technology, or science and expertise, as being no more than the representatives of some elite vested interest group, and for that reason opposed to the will of the people, and therefore something that should be discounted or ignored. In contrast, I think if you're trying to argue for the value of democracy, then you should find yourself defending science for the same reasons as you defend the judiciary or the press. Not because science is more true, so not an epistemic argument, but because it has an important role to play in this system of checks and balances. So I guess what this means in terms of how we might respond to the classic alternative facts rhetoric is that what we're saying, the consequence of this argument, is that to simply dismiss the alternative facts rhetoric as some kind of silly kind of something that's not very important is to miss the power of the claim that's being made. It's actually quite an important move that the populist government is making when it claims the right to assert alternative facts. What it's trying to do, in much the same way as it tries to diminish the credibility of the free press or reconstitute the judiciary in its own image, is it's trying to rebalance the hierarchy of knowledge, or hierarchy of expertise within the society in their favor. It's trying to reduce the status or the privilege of science in order to say that these claims deserve no special status at all. So it's part of a wider pattern of behavior. It's not a kind of idiosyncratic event. It's part of a sort of more systematic undermining of a system of checks and balances. And for that reason, we should be worried about it. And we should be saying no to this discourse of alternative facts. I mean, the examples are, they're not that important. The one on the bottom right is the most famous one. It's the crowd at President Trump's inauguration on the right, Obama's on the left, and Trump's claimed that his crowd was the biggest crowd ever in the history of inaugurations, when to most untrained eyes, it looks like there's more people in the left-hand photo. And that's where the idea of alternative facts comes from. As I say, there's a tendency to dismiss that as just being silly, but I think it hints at something more systematic and dangerous going on that we need to be concerned about. So what we're arguing, to bring this little section to a close, is that technological decision-making should take account of relevant technical expertise. That for the reasons I've outlined now, just briefly, that technical expertise, whether it's scientific or experience-based, that's gained in accordance with scientific values, is to be preferred over that which has not been gained that way. In terms of how that might filter out, and this, I guess, is where it differs from some of the more democratizing science stuff, is that if you see expertise as having a distribution, then it's not possible for everybody to be an expert about everything. So the people who are not the specialists need some knowledge about what the experts know, but they're never going to know as much as the experts. So there's still a role for some kind of mediating institution to communicate the content and strength of expert consensus, such as it is, to the wider population, such that they're able to exercise their democratic role in a kind of informed way. And then finally, just to reiterate this point, because we're often accused of being advocates of technocracy. We're not. What we're saying really is that technical advice, if it's seen as part of this system of checks and balances, does not determine the political decision, but what it does do is limit the ways in which it should be justified. I suppose just so to give a simple example, one of our PhD students, Martin Vinal, who's a co-author on the paper, his research was about the use of AZT to treat AIDS in South Africa when Thabo Mbeki was president. One of the ways in which Thabo Mbeki justified his decision not to use AZT was by claiming there was a scientific controversy at the time about the safety of the treatment. There was no meaningful scientific controversy at the time. Maybe 10, 15 years prior to that, there had been a controversy, but at the time he made the the statement, the science was as settled as it was ever going to be. And so what we're saying is that Mbeki should not have justified his decision in that way. There are other ways he could have justified it, and that would have been fine. He could have said that he was worried about the cost of it. He could have said he was worried about being in hock to multinational pharmaceutical companies. He might have said that he was worried about perpetuating a myth of Africa as a disease-ridden country. There are all kinds of justifications that he could have given, and they would have been fine. The point is the one that he did give was inaccurate, and he shouldn't have given it. And that's really our point. So just to sort of wrap up then, in terms of where we're going in terms of a sort of more how we might see these ideas applied in practice. Harry, being a great fan of physics, as those of you who know his work will know, has coined a phrase that derives from physics. He's talked about the conservation of democracy. And the idea that he's trying to capture here is that you can only get as much democracy out of a system as you put into it. I would rephrase that as saying that, again, going back to the Wittgensteinian ideas that we started with, we need to think about democracy as a practice and not just a set of ideas. And so democratic aspirations need to be preserved as organic aspects of society. But in doing that, that can only happen if the citizens and members of those societies actually live the practice of doing democracy. So clearly it's important to vote, but voting is not enough. There's a whole series of other things that also need to happen if democratic societies or democratic values are to successfully reproduce themselves. And I'm not saying these are easy, I'm just saying these are the things that I think need to happen. So one of the things that needs to happen is you have to accept that checks and balances are necessary, even when they don't work for you. Recognize that scientific and technical expertise is part of these checks and balances. And what we're arguing then is that a public understanding of the process of science, if you like, part of what, and this is perhaps our role as scholars and analysts of science, part of our role is to contribute to this public understanding of science so that people are able to understand what science can do, what it can't do, and have a more realistic set of expectations around it. So, for example, we might want to argue that science should no longer be seen as a truth machine. I mean, speaking to some of my undergraduate students, I think they already think this. They're kind of further off in that direction than I would like them to be. But certainly what seems to follow, I think, from STS is that there's no case for having a blind faith in science or treating it with unquestioned authority. So we can't go back that way. We can only go forward into a future in which we see that controversy is going to be the norm for science in most of the cases that matter to us as citizens. That said, I think we can also start to see, and this is where I think what I'm arguing kind of butts up against some of the other positions in mainstream STS, is even if we see that science is not impartial, it doesn't necessarily follow from that it's the unthinking stooge of political or other elites. And that's more the kind of dilemma we have to work our way through. Expertise can play an important role in challenging political decisions. And again, our role perhaps as professional analysts of science is to contribute to thinking through and advocating ways in which science and other forms of expertise might be used to hold political decisions to account, but also to inform them in a way that makes them a little bit better. I won't go through this in any detail. In the Why Democracies Need Science book, we have a suggestion for how this might be done. I've already kind of covered the main points of it. The idea is that you would need some committee of experts. The new innovation is that you would have sociologists and philosophers of science as part of that committee, that the outcome is really an indication of the strength and content of consensus, and that the idea is that this needs to be recognized by policymakers in terms of how they justify their decisions. So it's clear to citizens when policymakers are choosing, if they choose to either ignore a very strong consensus or take a big risk on the basis of something that's seen by the experts as radically uncertain. Other ways of doing it are possible, but I think the general principles are important. Okay, so just to sum up the main points. What I've tried to say, I suppose, is that all groups have these two faces. There's the organic and the normative, and that applies from the very small scale to the very large scale. If we think in particular about science and democracy, we can see that the organic faces of both these forms of life share some values, but not all values. If we think about democracy as a practice, it includes this idea of checks and balances, and I'm arguing that scientific expertise, or expertise more generally, is part of this system of checks and balances, but only part of it, like the Goldilocks porridge. You can't have too much, you can't have too little, but it is nevertheless an important part of it. And then if we want to defend democracy, then we must do our best to live by those values. And part of that is knowing how and when to trust expertise. Thank you.